a sense of, oh, there we go. So you're recording it, Mark.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So, yeah, I think we felt that, that it was incomplete, that there was more to be said, and certainly there were many more chapters of the book that we hadn't covered. And we just had a lot of fun. The most fun from those first several sessions was the more spontaneous Q&A that we had amongst ourselves and with the participants. And I certainly don't want to take away from that, but it's always nice to set the table. So I drew the short straw, and I'll be setting the table today. We have 3 topics that we'll be covering over the next 3 weeks, or definitely we will be using the book for 3 more topics on 3 other weeks, 3 weeks including this one. I think it is consecutive. So that this is the one that for me was the most interesting, both because there's a strong Jewish connection, and it's so much in contrast with what I've come to think, or at least to believe, through my training, is the Christian or a Christian way of looking at these very important chapters.
No. Oh, okay.
First chapters in Genesis. So I'm just going to ask if you can mute yourselves, or at least not to talk if you're unmuted. But definitely, if you have questions, put them in the chat, or raise your hand. There'll be times when I'll be sharing stuff. We'll all be sharing things, so we may not see a hand raised. So anyway, just do that. So today's topic is Adam and Eve and the Genesis creation story. And I thought, being lazy as I am, and now having at my disposal artificial intelligence, that I would ask Chat GPT. So now, I've gotten it doing some sermons for me. So I would ask it to come up with this lecture. So anyway, this isn't it. Here we go. Write a brief discussion of the symbolism of the Garden of Eden for a Jewish Christian interfaith class. I just kept it pretty simple, and you can see what it gave to me. Its preferred pronoun is it, because it's an it. The Garden of Eden is a biblical story found in the book of Genesis that serves as a foundation for the Jewish and Christian faiths. That's so far so good. By the way, I would add other faiths too, but I think this kept it simple for now. The story tells the creation of the first man and woman, Adam and Eve, and their placement in a beautiful garden where they were given the task to tend and care for it. It also tells of the serpent's temptation of Eve and the subsequent fall of humanity. One of the key symbols in the Garden of Eden story is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. This tree represents the potential for humanity to choose between good and evil and the consequences that come with that choice. It serves as a reminder that with free will comes responsibility and that actions have consequences. The serpent is also a significant symbol in the story, representing temptation and the influence of evil in the world. The serpent's deception of Eve and her subsequent disobedience to God's command serves as a reminder of the dangers of succumbing to temptation and the importance of staying true to one's beliefs. The Garden of Eden can also be seen as a symbol of paradise, presenting a perfect state of innocence and harmony with God. Adam and Eve's expulsion from the garden can be seen as a loss of innocence and the beginning of humanity's struggle with sin and imperfection. In Jewish tradition, the Garden of Eden is seen as a symbol of God's original plan for humanity and the world, and humanity's fall from that perfection. In Christianity, the Garden of Eden is often seen as a symbol of original sin, the state of humanity before the fall, and the need for redemption through Jesus. In summary, the Garden of Eden serves as a rich symbol in Jewish and Christian traditions. It represents the potential for humanity to choose between good and evil, the influence of evil in the world, and loss of innocence and perfection. Additionally, it also serves as a reminder of God's original plan for humanity and the need for redemption in Christianity. So that about does it for tonight. I think we can wrap it up. I'd love to just get quick impressions as to whether this is a critique of this particular tool now that we're suddenly being inundated with. Do you feel it covered the ground fairly? Did it make any blatant errors? And then we'll sort of dig in to some of these points that were made. But would anyone like to, give a first reaction? If we were to do Garden of Eden word association, I think it did pretty well. And I just did this in the last half hour, so I haven't had a chance to thoroughly critique or review it. But I think, as would be expected for artificial intelligence device that has combed the internet, there's a lot less Jewish stuff on the internet. So it would tend to lean toward a more Christian-based interpretation. But there's an awful lot of overlap between the two, so I can't really nitpick that much. Certain words here and there. Anyway, I thought it was interesting. It was a way to sort of break the ice to start. Now, I don't know if you've had a chance. Sorry, John has a point in the chat. Let me see. Clarify the wording. The garden was the original plan of God. Is that an accurate sense? A plan? Really? Well, that's a great question. You get the impression, and from doing this reading, and I hope some of you had a chance to read the chapter ahead of time, but I will put the link in the chat so you can read it afterwards too. There are different ways of looking at this. One is that God fully expected humanity to stay in the garden. That was sort of that. The fact that things did not go well was an annoyance. That, of course, takes away a bit of God's perfection. God can't be totally omnipotent and omniscient if that would be the case. But it does make for an interesting story because God becomes the fellow traveler as Adam and Eve leave the garden. And one very important point to make is that God leaves with them. So the garden was the original plan of God. I think the only way we can say that safely is that it's original in that it's in the first 3 chapters of Genesis. So it's original, like it's the first plan. It's the one that, it was plan A. Plan B came later on. But otherwise, I don't know, John, if that answers your question or if you have a point you want to make.
No, that's fine. I just, I see the word plan and yes, now you got plan B and the question, it evokes what's plan C and D and all the contingencies. If you talk plan. Right. No, this is a fascinating story. And, and part of it is because it can be interpreted in so many ways, so many different ways. So, all right, so let's dig in. There are, just as a reminder, 2 creation accounts in the book of Genesis. You got the one that's probably the better known in terms of the framework, the 6 days of creation, and then the 7th being the first Sabbath, all of the created items leading up to the ultimate creation, which is of the human being. And the human being is created as male and female. Hard to say exactly, whether that means this was one being or 2, but whatever it is, male and female are equal. Absolutely equal. And there is a Jewish there are legends that this was not Adam and Eve at that point. They're certainly not named at that point. And especially the woman would be this sort of figure of lore known as Lilith, who later became seen in somewhat evil terms, especially as threatening young children, babies being born, women in childbirth. And part of the reason for that notion is because that woman
that is created with man is equal. And that really scared a lot of the rabbis who couldn't quite come to grips with it. But as we see in our reading, the text itself, the book of Genesis, goes out of its way to show that woman was every bit the equal of man, not just in the first creation account, the 6th and 7th day, the 6 days of creation, but in the second account, which is the one that we're really focusing in on with the Garden of Eden. That's the account that has the Garden of Eden. And in that, the human being is literally planted into that garden. And that's where the story begins. Now, anyone have a question at this point? Okay. So at this, you would think from our reading of that second chapter, chapters 2 and 3, that that man is sort of created to be to rule over Eve. In fact, that terminology is used as they exit the garden, that man will rule over, that Eve is subservient. But the ideal, the Garden of Eden, is that idyllic place, paradise, for lack of a better term. That's how it was called in the Greek, in the Septuagint. So an idyllic past, not necessarily a projection of the future, but in that idyllic past, man, meaning humanity in this case, is in complete harmony with nature and in harmony with God. So we have that, and in a harmony with him, her, their selves. There was no sense of subservience at all on the part of the woman. In fact, they perhaps started out as one being. I'm summarizing a lot of the material, by the way, that's found in the reading, so you might find it familiar. But one of the main questions I want to cover here is women subservient. That's a key one that is addressed, I think, in the text, and that both Jewish and Christian traditions, both our traditions, really have to deal with in how, the book of Genesis leads to perceptions of that relationship and of marriage later on. So the second thing I'm going to just talk about is the Garden of Eden itself. Where was it? Is it paradise? And finally, I'm just going to touch upon sin and this forbidden fruit thing, because I think it would be much better for my colleagues to really delve into that. Not that they are sinners beyond me, but the whole notion of original sin is something that is somewhat alien to Judaism. So anyway, but let me get back to this subservience issue. Interesting that Adam and Eve don't get their names right away. They don't get their names till really late in the game, during the Garden of Eden cycle. And at first, Adam and Eve are called the person, ha-Adam. In Hebrew, the is ha. Adam means, of course, Adam, as it later became, but in this case, it means person. It actually more specifically means the one who was created out of the earth. The word Adamah in Hebrew is the earth. So that's an important factor here, that we could be talking about one being that, and in fact we are, that is both male and female, just as in the first chapter where it says God created the human being male and female, and then in God's image. The second chapter doesn't talk about God's image, but it does talk about the Adam. The authors talk about it, the translation of Claude, the physical nature of humanity. So they're created together. Now, this whole notion of Eve, or the woman, coming from the side of the man, or the rib, doesn't necessarily, and this they go out of their way, the authors, to talk about this, it doesn't necessarily mean subservience there either. To have been created second, or to have been sort of split apart, and in essence created second, so what? The whole book of Genesis is built on the premise that the second-born is usually the one who wins out. The second-born is usually triumphant. I mean, you go, Isaac and Ishmael, Isaac was the second born, at least in the biblical tradition. Jacob and Esau. Jacob is the second born. Joseph had a whole bunch of brothers born before him. And so you could say that it even begins with Adam and Eve, where Eve is they are birthed by God. They are nurtured. They are created in an organic sense from the earth by God. And then Eve from Adam, but still indirectly by God. No reason to see subservience in that second billing. The other thing that is important in terms of their creation is that Adam, or the Ha'adam, the man, the person, is created out of two substances. One is the earth, the clod, that image of clay, of being built out of clay. And the second is the life force. And I think this is also really important because the word is nephesh in Hebrew, which can also mean self, but and can certainly, and the Septuagint defines it in Greek as psyche, so the mind. But it really, the term soul really doesn't come into play at this point. The idea of an immortal soul is something we'll see as the religions develop it, but right now that's not the case. So no subordination. Okay, I'm just telling you. Last is definitely not least, and the way the authors describe it, they're at that point, they are a very happy naked couple in this Garden of Eden, of this place of complete harmony. So let's talk a little about the Garden of Eden. Bliss. The word Eden, in Book of Psalms, you see V'nachal adanecha tishakem. You should drink at a refreshing stream, a place of complete bliss, as I said, of delight. So that is what the Garden of Eden is in the initial text. It is not paradise in the sense of it's a projection back into the past, into a mythic past, but a perfect past. And it's a past that we always try to return to, but it's not seen as heaven or as a precursor for heaven. Later, it became conflated with the notion of heaven. And I'm talking just about Jewish tradition. Others can speak to their specialties, but in terms of Jewish tradition, I'll show you an example, if I can get to it. Okay. So when the medieval prayer for the dead, which we use to this day, El Malei Rachamim, beautiful, beautiful, passionate prayer. Anytime we have a memorial service or memorialize a single person, we use this prayer. And it pleads for God to grant presence, grant divine radiance to these souls. May their memory be for a blessing, and may they rest in paradise. In Hebrew, the term that's used is Gan Eden. Gan Eden tehei menuchatam. It's in about middle of the paragraph if you want to look for it. Anyway, so within Jewish tradition, so I'm not saying that, this is not Jewish to speak of the Garden of Eden in terms of paradise. It very much is seen that way. We talk about Gan Eden a lot in our folklore as being a place of, future aspiration, and not just looking back at what was once upon a time, this perfect place. But what it aspires to is a restoration, not of purity from sin, and I think that's where the traditions may diverge, but a restoration of this harmony that existed between humanity and nature, between people and God, and between the people themselves, between man and woman. Immediately when they sin, for lack of a better term, they disobey, I guess would be the term, things happen. But what happens is that they just encounter civilization. Now, it's my perspective, my feeling that this may be what God wanted all along, whether or not God planned it, but that if there hadn't been this expulsion from the garden and this encounter with civilization, the first sign of civilization is recognizing their nakedness and covering up, wearing clothes. If they hadn't done this, history wouldn't have happened. History needed to be triggered, needed to be set forth by that act of disobedience, or whatever it was that led God to drive them from the garden. The authors say it wasn't so much the act of disobedience as the recognition that now that they knew the difference from good and evil, now that they had a degree of intelligence, they would eat from the tree of life, and that's what God wanted to protect. God did not want immortality to be achieved through that. There was the plan B. Originally, they would have been immortal had they stayed in the garden, but plan B, once they had eaten from the other tree, was to have kids. That was the immortality, that there would be future generations. And that immortality allowed them to overcome mortality. Overcome, their being mortal. Well, a couple of other things about the Garden of Eden. Another, and this is brought up by the authors, we don't know where it was. It says in the east, Mikedem. And then it lists 4 rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. We know where they are. But then Pishon in southwest Arabia, Gihon in Ethiopia. These are very far apart, but with the land of Israel pretty much in the middle of all of these places. The 4 rivers never meet. So to say that this is the place where there's a confluence is basically to say that it's no place. It's no known place. It is a mythical place. It is literally never land. And that's, where Adam and Eve, little boys and girls, were not supposed to grow up. So quickly about sin and about their punishments for the action. We won't get to the forbidden fruit. Was the woman guilty? The text is unclear. There's a very interesting proposal made in the chapter that Adam ate the fruit not because Eve deceived him, but because he recognized that Eve had eaten from the fruit, and she would have been the first one. She would have suffered alone. She would have ended up having to be expelled by herself and become mortal by herself. But by eating, he sacrificed immortality for her sake. So it turns it from a horrible domino effect of sin, turns it from that into an incredible love story. And then this love story continues because God sends them out, because God wants to keep them away from that other tree, gives them instructions that, you're going to have kids, but it will be painful, but that's not really a punishment. It's a consequence. And then God shows that, in a sense, all is forgiven by making clothing for them. That's another one of the most beautiful things that you see in these chapters. The notion that God is not punishing, but instead nurturing and setting them on their way, sending them off by creating, more clothes for them. I think that's beautiful. Anyway, and of course there'll be toil. Adam's going to have to work the land. No more harmony with nature. Won't come easily. Not so much a punishment, but an imbalance. It's a recognition of the imbalance that's been created by their actions, the consequences of their actions, and the loss of that harmony. Yes, that harmony was beautiful. Jews pray every day when we return the Torah to the ark. The Torah, by the way, is God's love. is a symbol of God's love. So for Jews, we don't necessarily rely on something like forgiveness for original sin. We have the Torah as that symbol. And when we put the Torah back in the ark, in our services, we recite a line from Lamentations, return us unto you, and we shall return, renew our days as of old. Chadesh Yamenu Kedem. The word Kedem means old and before, but it also means east. It's a fascinating play on words because it's the same word that was used in regard to the Garden of Eden. So I think I'm going to stop here, already having taken half the class, which I think was what we always aimed for last time too. The introductory, yeah, thanks, Mark. Okay, so let me just toss it to either my colleagues or if anyone wants to have a question answered right now.
Well, I'll jump in. Josh, thanks for a wonderful recap. And some of the things I mean, there certainly are some distinctions within the Christian tradition between the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition. I love Genesis 2. I think that it's such a great story. It's the earlier story, actually, of the two creation accounts. And it has this mythical element to it. One of the things I love is just there's a playfulness to the storytelling. When you read the story, for instance, the human is made out of the earth, but there's this whole back and forth between God and the human as to what is the appropriate helpmate. And, humans are co-creators in the creation in the Genesis 2 account. God, creates something and brings it to Adam to see if this is, a helpmate. And the human names it, and then, but it's not the right thing. And so then God goes back and brings something else, and the human names it, but it's not, the right helpmate. And then finally you get this encounter with when Eve is created out of the rib of Adam. This at last is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. And obviously, for a long time, the Christian tradition read it as derivative, and woman was and I think a more helpful rendering is that the woman is the pinnacle of creation, right? It's that things aren't complete until that moment, and I think that's again such a wonderful part of the narrative. The further the encounter with, when I teach this with kids, not so much anymore because they don't know the story, or with adults, you'll ask like who are the characters, and the serpent is a snake, the fruit is an apple, and it's a reflection, I think, more that Paradise Lost is more informing what we're thinking about the text than the Bible itself. I think that one of the important statements in that narrative, when the humans eat the fruit, is that there's this great line. The serpent and Eve are having this conversation, but there's a tag that says, she took it and gave it to the man who was with.
We're losing you, Mark.
So the conversation, he's just not, the dumb guy just kind of standing, happening. Okay. So it isn't that the woman is the only one who takes of it, and then she basically either tricks her husband or, coerces him into it. I mean, he's there all along. And that's also a part of the I think such an important piece of the narrative. But I think that, the not derivative, but pinnacle of creation, and, how the humans are there together. I think from a Christian perspective, the reading of the narrative, and Josh is right about, this is kind of the classic story of in Christian theology of original sin. If Adam and Eve are a type, then obviously Jesus is a type, and the New Testament goes to great lengths, I think, to try to say, not like Adam and Eve, not Jesus doesn't do what they did. And the sin, could talk about it as disobedience. God says, don't do this. But there's a wonderful statement out of Philippians of the desire to be God. And that's part of the temptation. The serpent says, the people say, we're not supposed to eat it. And the serpent says, oh, you can eat of it. You're not going to die. You'll be like God. And what's not attractive about that? To be able to be like God. So the narrative in the New Testament, where Jesus is the counter to that, is that in Philippians, it talks about, that Jesus, even though he was, equal with God, did not seek equality with God as something to be desired, but emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant. So, there's this, the typology is changed, from the Christian perspective in the person of Jesus. And so it's not, there is disobedience, but it really, I think, is there's such a human aspect to this story about, we want to be something that we're not, and hubris, and how that plays into what we end up doing at various points in our life, which I think it's, to me, the best expression of original sin is really what Paul says. And that is, the thing that I want to do is the thing that I don't do. And the thing that I don't want to do is the thing that I end up doing. And I think that we all have examples of that in life.
If you have not read the first couple of chapters of Genesis, I really encourage you to go back and do that. And first, just note that the first one, written by priestly writers, that's the P writers is how it's marked in commentaries usually. That's the very structured one, where it goes through the 7 days, and God said, let there be, and boom, it happens. So we've got this majestic, creative God who creates simply by speaking, and things come into being. There's a declaration that it's good, and then there was night and day. And so it's very ordered, and you would expect that from priests, because this is very likely liturgy. If you think of it in a worship setting, that would be the way that priests would write. And so compare that with the material that we're really looking at, which is the second account, as has been noted, the older one by the Yahwistic writers. And what you get there is not this majestic, aloof, cosmic God, but you get a very intimate, personal God. And so when it's time to create the human being, it's like God gets down in the mud on God's knees and fashions like a potterer, and then leans over and blows into the nostrils. It's very, very intimate and personal. And then when the woman is created, there's this, the man is put to sleep, and the rib is taken out, and a woman is fashioned. When you get to chapter 3, that's often designated as the fall, God is walking in the cool of the garden, taking a stroll, and wants to know where they're at. Why are you hiding? So it's a very personal rendition of God. And I think you should note the two different accounts, because in my view, it's the clearest and most convincing way not to take that stuff literally, which huge portions of Christianity still do. Our more fundamentalist, literalistic folk do that, and I think to the detriment of how the texts are actually told. And so in Genesis 2 and 3, just lose yourself into the story and see what it is God might be telling you. That's a wonderful way to approach it. The other thing to remember is, if this is not literal history, well, what is it? The word myth is used a couple of times in this chapter, and myth, unfortunately, I think in modern times means not true. Oh, it's just a myth. Well, that's not it. Myth is a literary genre that is usually story that contains deep, deep truths. I mean, I think of the stories that the rabbis tell. I mean, they may be made up, but they're making big truths. When Jesus told parables, they weren't literal happenings, but they portrayed great truths. So when you read the early Genesis material, things like, who is God? Well, God is creator of all things. And where does humankind fit in this? Well, humankind has a rather special place in the created order, and in fact is given responsibilities. And that there is a huge relationship between, a special relationship between the creator and the created. When Mark talked about the blame game in the garden after the fruit is eaten, I think too it's impossible to somehow paint the woman as the cause of the fall because she ate and then gave some to the man. In fact, they both had the exact same choice, to obey or to disobey, and so they both chose. So that gracious interpretation that Josh shared from the chapter about the man being really noble so that the woman wouldn't be alone. Yeah, I don't buy that one. Not in your life. That doesn't square with my experience. And then if you think about how when Mark talked about the temptation of wanting to be like God, all the way through chapter 11, which 1 through 11 is often called prehistory material. That's the mythic material of ancient Israel. If you think about it, even the Tower of Babel is another trying to be like God, because when they build that tower, where do they want to build it to? To the heavens, to be on the same level as God, and they're being, again, ambitious. They're not content to be creature. They want to be like creator. And so I think all of that material ends up tying together in the first 11 chapters. That when the fall happens, it is a ripple effect that moves us through Noah and the flood and the first murder and Tower of Babel. I also wish that the word original sin was not used. Original doesn't help, frankly, anything. It comes from Augustine, who saw who would have taken the material literally, and it would be original because it was the first one, right? It was the first sin. And by virtue of being related to Adam, it is something that is passed from generation to generation to generation. And it was the original sin that all of us participate in. I think it's more helpful to talk about sin as being both action and condition. And that if that material in Genesis 3 tells us anything, it may say that we always have a propensity to be rebellious. We always have an inclination to try to be like God, that we prefer to be independent than dependent. And those are the things that get us in trouble. So it's both, we're hardwired, if you will, like a condition in order to be rebellious. So that's another way to kind of look at it, both action and condition. Talking about original, that tends to then push us, I think, into kind of a literal understanding of the Genesis material that frankly doesn't lend itself very well theologically anymore.
So if I'll dovetail on that by just quoting from the chapter, and I've put the link in the chat, by the way. For the rabbis, the idea of an Edenic fall is a minority opinion. More popular are countervailing claims suggesting that everything, including death, was part of the divine plan. Sorry about that. A Midrash, Genesis Rabbah, reports that Rabbi Meir's Torah scroll, instead of saying at the end of creation that everything was very good, in Hebrew Tov Ma'od, read death was good, Hebrew Tov Mavet. It's almost literally the same spelling. This fanciful claim implies that the mortality bestowed upon all of Adam's descendants cannot be seen as a curse. Indeed, the predominant rabbinic opinion is that Adam is not guilty of any original sin. And then it talks about, it gives an example from the Midrash. But that death, in fact, is introduced to the world because of the actions that took place. And it's a good thing. Tov Ma'od, that death is necessary to have meaningful life. So, and one other point I just want to make, I kind of like the way the whole notion of original sin is used in the idea of evil inclination. Are we innately sinful, or are we innately neutral? I think Judaism tends to believe that human beings were created perhaps with that capacity for rebellion. No doubt, we all have a little rebellious streak, but that isn't necessarily evil. So the rabbis talk in the Talmud a lot about having, this, like in the cartoons, the angel and the devil standing over our heads, and one, pushing us one way, one pushing us the other, that within our psyches, within our souls, we have the capacity to do either one. And our job in life is to cultivate the good, the angelic side, as opposed to having in our nature the idea of being evil. Now, I'm not sure where that stands in terms of theology as developed over time in the Christian world.
The Christian world, actually, Josh, has got a wonderful recovery, and there are those who are see it as a little heretical, but not even neutral, but original blessing. And so, the Genesis 1 account, after every day, God sees what is created and calls it good. And there's this sense that the humans are no different. Let us make human beings in our image, in the image of God. Let us make them. So there is this idea, I think, from that narrative, an idea of, again, original blessing, original goodness. There's also, we've used the word fall, and I had a wonderful professor when I was in seminary who talked about, you think about the fall downward. So there was this sense, it intimated that there was this initial goodness, or again, idyllic, Edenic place. And then there was a falling away, using that sense about, again, striving to be something that we're not. He talked about it as the fall upward. That was the problem, is that we kept reaching to be something that we weren't.
I want to return also, I'm sorry, to one other thing that I brought up at the beginning of my talk. There is sort of an inconsistency here in that Eden is seen as a place of this idyllic relationship between human beings, one and to the other, and with God. But then at the end, God says that man will rule over, Yimshol will rule over a woman as they're about to leave the garden, that women will be subordinate. So you come away wondering whether this is the divine plan. And of course, that's led to an incredible amount of misogyny over and I'm not just saying from one religion. I think both of our faiths have their fair share. So the authors talk about this. It's actually on page 116, if anyone wants to look for it. That is a consequence of entering into civilization. And what this reveals is a clear anti-civilization bias. Eden was Club Med, the antidote to civilization. And that probably dates me, that commercial. But this idea that that once you leave civilization, then as you take this journey from chapter 2, 3 to chapter, to the Noah story, and you get to the Tower of Babel, that is the ultimate of civilization, which is seen in many ways as the ultimate of evil, which all of which goes to really emphasize, to place the focus on how much the Torah, the Bible, the Old Testament is leaning toward sustainability and leaning toward custodianship, and I think that's a term we all use, and the need to care for the earth and to nurture the earth and to disdain the exploitation that comes with increased civilization. Civilization has its place. Genesis 1 talks about conquering the creation, but it certainly is less pronounced than the need for sustainability.
Well, and just Josh, I mean the word for in Genesis 1 to have dominion over is the Hebrew more, is it better read steward, or is it better caretaker language, or is it dominance language?
In Genesis 1, it's dominance. It actually is the word kivshuha, which is conquest. The word that would have been used for like taking over Jericho or conquering cities in Canaan. That's the word that's used. So it's really dramatic in the difference between that and tilling the land and becoming the caretaker of the animals and of creation in chapters 2 and 3.
Right. Wow.
Which is why I love it that they're both together. If P and J can coexist, then
right.
we're all good. And they're in the same Bible. They were, and I know there are many other examples of that. Contradictions. The editor said, hey, let's just put it all in and let them figure it out in a few thousand years. So Jonathan has a chat remark. If the human project is to cultivate our angelic side, is that a parallel to the post-Edenic project to cultivate the earth? So spiritual and material sustenance outside Eden's paradise requires effort and are not givens. Are not a given. And I think that is the punishment, so to speak, of Adam having to till the land. And Eve having to give birth in pain, but nothing is going to come easy after they've left the garden. They'll really look back on it and wonder, what did they do? But we needed them to leave, or we wouldn't be here.
Other thoughts from the group?
Meryl.
Unmute yourself, please, Meryl.
If Eve is given as Adam's helpmeet, or whatever that word is, then her giving him the fruit was helpful to him. And so that's, I think, another contradiction, that she's there to help guide him, take care of him, whatever. And then when they're tossed out of the garden, you get this turnaround.
Yeah, there's no question that I want to talk about the helpmeet, because that's a really important word that is often misinterpreted. Ezra Ezer kenegdo. Ezra in Hebrew means help, and so a helper who is opposite him, neged. It also connotes conflict, although really what it means is, two heads banging together to come up with a solution kind of conflict. And the authors talk about this too, that God is often called in Ezra. We have a prayer in our prayer book, Ezrat Avotenu. God is the helper of our ancestors. So to be a helpmeet doesn't mean sidekick. That's just important to say that, again, Eve is seen as being completely equal to Adam. As for the fruit, I don't know if this answers your question, Meryl, but it clearly wasn't an apple because the apples weren't introduced to that part of the world yet. But I think I know what fruit it was. I think it has to be a fig because figs are delicious, and probably it was like made into a fig Newton or something, which I would never have been able to resist. And as soon as they eat it, they use a fig leaf to cover themselves. So that's the tree they were next to.
That's great, Josh. Love it.
So Meryl, did you want to respond?
I'm not arguing about fruit.
I know.
It's fine.
Restate your point, because I'm sure I missed it then.
My point was that it was helpful for Eve to give the fruit to Adam. It wasn't a bad thing because she was put there to help him.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I agree. Suzanne had a question. I'm sorry, that's Norman. I know that it says Suzanne, but I think it's Norman. When Adam and Eve enter civilization, why do we not hear about their many children? Well, we are among their children. That's the beauty of it. And in my mind, that is why the story is there, aside from all the sustainability stuff, so that every human being has the same ancestor. And they, I think, have found an actual Eve archaeologically going way back, who was probably the first human being. Anyway, but we do read about their kids in subsequent chapters.
Right. Well, and I think to Duane's point, your prehistory and what I love about, and I would imagine the rabbis do a lot more of it in terms of, what are all the areas that are blank, right? The open spaces are just kind of, you drive a Mack truck through with all of the various interpretations that that could potentially be there. I think that's part of the, the beauty of the text is that there's the spoken stuff that you reflect on, but then there's all the unspoken stuff that's in between all the lines, in terms of, what about this? What about that? And there aren't any answers there. That's part of the beauty of the text as well, is that you can continue to play with it and come up with various responses.
There actually is a beautiful midrash, I really love this midrash. Adam and Eve, or actually Adam at this point, was sleeping the first night. The second creation story takes place in one day, so it's a very long but amazing day. But of course, it's the first night, so Adam would not have known what that meant. It got dark. What's going to happen now? And he was concerned that was the end, that creation was going to be undone. And then, of course, he got tired and went to sleep, and that was also very scary. Imagine for the first time, he wakes up and he suddenly sees the sun coming up and realizes the miracle. He had gone to sleep thinking that he was such a sinner for having created this darkness, having made the darkness happen. And then God, shows him this beautiful world and takes him for a walk around the garden and says, see how beautiful this garden is. It's yours now. and it's one of those sustainability kinds of arguments. If you ruin it, there will be no one who can replace it. So that's a story that the rabbis did thousands of years ago, which could well come out of any of us right now. But there's relatively little about Adam and Eve in the Midrash, and almost nothing in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, after the book of Genesis. So they're relatively minor figures in terms of Jewish lore, but important ones in some ways still.
So Josh, since we're talking about filling in the blanks, can you tell us more about Lilith? Because I'm pretty sure at least some of my folks won't have the slightest idea who that is.
Yeah, I probably shouldn't have opened that can of worms.
But since it comes from your tradition, you need to tell it.
The misogyny is just astounding, that they had to figure out a way that a woman could be so powerful and equal to the man, equal to Adam. So they had her as almost like almost a fallen angel. I mean, equivalent to that. And in Jewish folklore, you have lots of angel type figures who would haunt, normal subservient women and their children. So especially in the Babylonian period, during the rabbinic period, after the Second Temple was destroyed, you have widespread belief in Lilith. And of course, always, the mortality rate was so high. I mean, it was almost miraculous for children to live beyond a few weeks. And they had a lot of kids because many of them didn't live. So there have been discoveries of magical bowls that were created, and meaning bowls with incantations on them. This is all folklore. It's not, part of the authorized religion, but that's the real religion, the folk religion. And they would bury these bowls in front of the house on the doorstep, so that they would keep Lilith away from haunting the house and putting in jeopardy their babies. So there's a really extensive literature about Lilith, and it's sort of, she takes her place alongside the golem and the Dybbuk, sort of these devilish type characters of Jewish folklore. So much
She's
so
she's Adam's first wife, though, right?
Yes. So she was the one that was created in chapter 1, where neither of them has a name. But it doesn't matter that Adam doesn't have a name. They had to figure out who this Lilith was, who this woman was, who couldn't possibly have been as nice as Eve later on. And the other, the footnote to this is that a Jewish feminist magazine came about in the 1960s as feminism came of age, and it's called Lilith Magazine. And it's pretty popular, I think, to this day.
Marjorie, unmute. Yeah.
Since we're related, Uncle Josh, it was it the Gregorian calendar that messed up our being able to celebrate on the same day?
Celebrate what on the same day? I'm sorry.
Sabbath.
Oh, no, I think, and others can correct me, I think that was a deliberate decision to separate early Christianity from its Jewish roots.
Yeah. So for Christians, that Sunday as Sabbath, obviously is day of resurrection, and like literally every Sunday is understood as a resurrection, as Easter. So that when we do Lent, we count the days in Lent, but Sundays aren't a part of the count because they're like a day, that day of the day of rest, but also they're not in the theme of Lent.
They're in Lent, but not of Lent.
Yeah.
And I did not know that. It's interesting.
So, Dom?
I just wanted to add one more point because, I talk too much. You mentioned the calendar. An important point to make is that Rosh Hashanah is called the birthday of the world. Rosh Hashanah celebrates creation, just as Passover celebrates the Exodus. Rosh Hashanah is a commemoration of creation, but there isn't a single mention of Adam and Eve or of chapter 2 or 3. It's all about just creation, and it's really a celebration of God's role in that process, which I think is another indicator that Adam is a relatively minor figure, even as related to that.
Dom, did you have a question?
Yeah, Rabbi, did I hear you before saying that Adam took his bite of the apple after Eve to cement the relationship in simple terms, or to make sure that she was not alone? Did I hear you correctly?
Yeah, and that came from the chapter, and I had never heard that before. I thought it was actually sort of brilliant, but not terribly believable either.
It's a wonderful love story, maybe the first instance of a true love story in the Bible.
Yeah.
But there couldn't have been one before.
It calls to mind something we heard Barbara Bush say once: a marriage works if each partner gives 65%.
Any other questions or thoughts? Well, this is great. Thanks so much for the introduction, Josh. As he mentioned, we'll continue on. I forget offhand what we're doing next week, but we'll be gathering on February 2nd and February 9th, 6:30 p.m., same link. And please join us, invite your friends. Really, really wonderful conversation. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. It's Psalm 22. Why have you forsaken me? So next week, be really interesting.
Yes, Psalm 22. Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Duane. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.